Welcome, everybody, for another episode of Men and Sex. This is a podcast all about normalizing conversations around sexuality. I'm your host, Mr. Wood, and today I'm really excited. I've got one of my teachers, someone I consider a dear friend, but someone I've been learning for I don't even know how many years now. It's got to be over five. Like I don't
Yeah,
even
it's getting close to 10.
one of my first experiences. This is Deus Fortier. Is that how I say
You
it?
got it.
Beautiful. The first time I experienced Deus, I went to a festival in Canada. He did some spoken word and taught a class, and I just had this hit. I just had this knowing. I was like, I gotta learn from this guy. I want to learn from this guy. And it was actually when some beautiful serendipity started happening in my life to be a part of the Impeccable Man's master class. So, Deus, tell the audience a bit about yourself, what you do, and then we'll dive into it.
Sure, I'll try to give the nutshell version to this because it's a long story. I have a professional and personal experience in a huge range of things. When you and I were first introduced, the workshop that I was leading was connected to transformational art, which was the first like official modality that I got certified in, which was a combination of Kriya Yoga philosophy, art therapy, and consciousness studies. But I spent most of my 20s exploring and learning in a huge variety of fields, from esoteric mysticism to transformational art to different relational and leadership skills, psychedelics. And since that time, my training is ongoing. I'm doing 2 or 3 trainings every year, from body-centered psychotherapeutics, trauma-informed facilitation, shamanism, sexuality, indigenous traditions. And so I kind of integrate all of those things into a variety of things, from men's retreats that focus more on eroticism and maturity, de-armoring, mythopoetics, as well as more private sessions, including breath work, plant medicine ceremonies, sound healing, and my own private practice, which is coaching, which is a synthesis of all of those things. So about 10 years of professional facilitation experience and about 2 decades of immersive study and practice and a whole bunch of different things.
I was just trying to remember because I did Deus's training, the Impeccable Man's Masterclass. Wonderful training, highly recommend it. And we had some time apart where we weren't really working together. I sat with you in a ceremony. We stayed in touch, but once again, there was a serendipity of us coming back together. I had no idea that you were diving so deeply into sexuality, and I was at the same time. So it was once again this beautiful synchronicity. I remember when I started coaching with you again, it wasn't to focus on sexuality, but it was such a magical, perfect thing because you were on your journey, I was on my journey, and it was this perfect match. So I'm excited to have you on the show. And one of the topics that I wanted to bring forward for the audience is something that a term that I really learned from you and in this last round of coaching that we did together was the world of conscious kink. So let's just talk about that for a second and bring in any simple way to explain that to the listeners of what that is.
Sure. I would probably start by taking one step back and
Please.
just looking at a concept that I call eros.
Mm,
Eros as life force, pure life force that's responsible for giving birth to all things. So, Eros is this energy that flows in and through us that is responsible for all forms of attraction, arousal, creative expression, intimacy. It's the force that draws us into intimate connection with something else. And through that intimate encounter, it gives birth to something new. So, this shows up not only in sex, but also in our professional endeavors, in our creative activities, in our relationship to ourselves, to feelings and expressions. And it also ties into sexuality. So, this distinction is really important to know that eros is connected to sex, but it is also distinct. It's a
mm.
much larger territory that we're exploring than just sex itself, which is one channel through which that energy can be explored and expressed in a lot of heightened ways. And a lot of our patterns and our deep psyche is actually revealed through our sexual encounters. But as most people will notice once they start going into this field, those patterns also play themselves out in all different territories of our lives, not just sex. So I wanted to make that distinction because conscious kink is a way of learning how to use consciousness to explore sexuality and exploring sexuality as a way of understanding consciousness. And
Mm,
the word kink is very highly charged and
yeah.
misunderstood by a lot of people. A lot of people think it's like really hardcore BDSM, like hurting each other. And
Yeah.
that can definitely be a part of it,
Yeah.
but conscious kink is about slowing things way down and exploring erotic and sexual territory that falls out of the culturally normative ways of relating to one another that
Mm,
all of us are still subject to, but often aren't consciously exploring or having conversations about. So, conscious kink is also kind of like an umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of different things. But some of the territory, some of the categories that we can explore through conscious kink, the foundation is consent and boundaries and understanding what those things actually are and how to get a tangible, visceral, embodied sense of those things
mm,
because they're not rigid, cemented structures. I'll just use boundaries as an example. If I'm open to a certain type of intimate encounter with someone in my bedroom, like with my partner, it doesn't mean that I'm available for that kind of encounter in a different environment with my
mm,
partner.
mm,
Or if I'm with another person, my boundaries will shift and change depending on who I'm with, what my mood is, what my energy levels are, the environment that I'm in. And so we have to get a tangible sense of how we become aware of what our boundaries are on a visceral level in response to a living encounter.
mm.
And then from that place, we can start exploring consent. What are we giving permission for? How do we say no? How do we receive no? All those things that are foundational principles for the safety of an erotic encounter, regardless of whether it's sexual or not.
Yeah.
So, consent and boundaries is the core. And then from there, you can start exploring edgier territories such as power dynamics,
Mm,
such as Dom sub role play. You can start exploring sense play or impact play, how certain sensations are received and what the lingering after effects are, and what that can bring up in people through like different associations. I can give an example of that. I was working with one person who was male, actually, he was a friend of mine, and he wanted to get more of like a rowdy kind of energy because it's like really playful and enlivening for him. So I'm kind of like moving him around and like pushing. And then he had a memory of a time that he was bullied as a child, and it started actually bringing up some sadness. And so we
mm.
started sitting with that feeling and letting it start to unwind itself out of his nervous system by offering more loving contact and soothing in response to what was showing up for him. So, just as an example, different sensations, different qualities of sensations bring up different things for different people, and you can use that as a point of exploration. Then you can also start exploring some of the kinkier, edgier territories, such as consensual non consent, of like forcing another or being forced within a consensual encounter. And there's ways to set that up. And then you can also start experimenting with things like pain sensations, which only become a problem when you actually cross the threshold into harm. And if you stay below that threshold, you can actually find a lot of pleasure in the sensation that we normally call pain. So, a big part of kink is about destigmatizing the territory,
Mm.
understanding our own erotic conditioning, what contributes to peak arousal states, what we've learned about sex when we were young, and integrating all of those things so that we can be more attuned to and communicative of our real needs, desires, and boundaries from an unempowered place. It's not about going into like the deep, dark shadow of sexuality. It's more about destigmatizing it all so that we can access it from an unempowered place of awareness and consciousness.
Mm. I want to share my own experience with you to the
Please.
listeners because it was not sexual, but I went and saw Deus in Canada and we had an experience with the boundaries, with the consent, and it blew my mind. I was blown away at realizing how difficult some things were for me and how easier some things were for me. And then in some pieces just did not compute. I really realized how I don't have how hard it was for me to have clear boundaries and that decisiveness that is like this is my boundary, and then also discovered how difficult it was to clearly state what my desires were, what I wanted, how I wanted it, at what level. So I think that's such a beautiful piece that you bring up. And I would love it to be a practice that is outside of sexuality, that it's just more normal. We get to do this because I walked away from that experience like I learned so much about myself, and it had nothing to do with sexuality, and it had a huge part of every relationship that I have in my life.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. This is why I started with untethering eros from sexuality, and it's
Thank you.
especially important between men because, there is a longing in most men for deeper connections with each other and a longing for intimacy. But there's a lot of sexual associations immediately when we go into more intimate exchange that's wrapped around fear and shame and guilt and all sorts of things. And my colleague Ian McKenzie and we refer to this whole kind of broad territory of eros as the forbidden topic in our culture, where if we don't have spaces where we're learning about these things, where we can talk about these things, which is extremely rare in our culture, say the suppression of pleasure or the judging or the criticism of pleasure, sexually especially, if that is criticized or we're punished for that, then we're going to start suppressing the movement towards those things. But that doesn't suppress the desire for them. And so that's when we start pushing things into what you could call shadow territory,
Mm,
where it starts taking on more nefarious expressions, where we're trying to satisfy our very understandable longings and desires, but we have to hide it and manipulate people in order to get what we want, because just to admit that we're looking for something um, could potentially lead to punishment, and you
mm,
see this a lot in our culture of the toxic masculine or,
right.
predatory energy and all sorts of things. So it's actually the demonizing of these things that creates a lot of the shadow expressions of it. Versus if we were to actually just have open and honest explorations, it starts to illuminate that territory. And as I was saying before, destigmatizing it so that we can start finding ourselves in relationship to one another. And one of the things that you're speaking to here is what are your um, needs, desires, and boundaries in connection to another man? And how does that tie into different qualities of sensation, but also power dynamics? A lot of the time, men are taught that our value comes from being in a dominant role, a dominant position, the one who's in control, the one who's in charge, the one who's deciding and pursuing the thing that we want. And so being in a more submissive or receptive state is inherently emasculating. There's
Mm,
actually a lot of power in that position of being the center of someone's attention, the source of their pleasure, of being deeply wanted and being deeply attuned to.
mm,
The in those kinds of encounters, the sub is, yes, they're pursuing their desires. Sorry, the dom is pursuing their desires, but the sub never relinquishes their own personal boundaries. So just imagine this for a moment, being in a position where you know that everything that happens is going to please your partner and you don't need to do anything that you don't want to do. How good is that? you know,
yeah, totally.
it's pretty juicy territory if you can just let yourself be taken by someone who's turned on by you and taking what they want and you want them to take it. So this is one of the reasons why consent is the biggest foundation, because ideally in any kind of exchange, both people are being served and supported in
Right.
different ways. And finding the freedom and the power that exists in both of those roles just opens up so much territory in our own lives. I saw a post like, I don't know, 6 months ago or so. Somebody was saying that you can only be a good leader if you know how to be a good follower.
Mm,
Because what is a follower? A follower is somebody who is receptive and responsive to the guidance of an other. And what are the consequences of living a life where you are completely shut off from feedback of your environment and adapting yourself appropriately? You become very narrow minded, extremely rigid, forceful, and you start propagating yourself onto other people and kind of infringing upon their own free will. And
Mm,
trying to rope them into your own desires without any consideration of their experience. And,
mm.
this is, you see this all over our world, everybody trying to assert their own way on others. And if they don't subscribe to that, then they try to punish them. They're trying to enforce their own internal desires upon other people as a mandate. And that
Yeah.
is one of the things that actually fuels a lot of hostile, aggressive, adversarial relationships. So it's important to be able to cultivate both of these roles, both of these energies, and to figure out where we are contracting when placed in both of those roles, learning how to soften those things to realize that we're actually not under threat right now. And there's value and power to be found in all of those spaces that we have deemed inappropriate or inaccessible for whatever reason. This is one of the things that conscious kink can open up for us in practical, experiential ways, not just theoretical, but
Mm.
actually embodied experiential ways. You can get a tangible sense of that and the value that it holds for you.
That was another piece that was profound in my experience coming up to Vancouver. And it felt so uncomfortable to be in the, sub role or not in the dominant position. I just remember my mind and body being so confused and like, it's like almost protective mechanisms coming online, and then having to be like, we're safe. It's okay. Like there's guidelines here. Like you said, I'm actually in the position of power. I say no. I say how much. I say whatever. And it is a really interesting mental thing that I felt myself on in the edge of or coming up against that I'm sure there's many layers to that as I went deeper into that experience, I would bump up to more of those protection layers or beliefs. This is wrong. I need to be the one in the dominant role or whatever. And I love that you brought, well, until I know how to exist as a good follower, that's also has leadership in that following position, then I won't have those, I won't have that balance as a leader. I won't have that balance as someone that's in the position of dictating or organizing or saying, hey,
Yeah.
let's head in this direction.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because, if you were to find the core of it, it's really the Dom is the one who's deciding the direction. And there's so many areas in our life where this is playing out that have nothing to do with sex. Like if you think of any of your relationships with a teacher or a mentor, you're opening up to them to receive guidance because there's a level of trust and safety with them. And you are allowing yourself to be affected in a way that is enhancing your own understanding or experience of life. There's real value in opening up to people who can offer you that guidance in that direction.
Mm,
So being able to cultivate that as a skill also in a leadership position is extremely important.
mm,
Like when Ian and I are facilitating in-person men's retreats, we describe our style of facilitation as emergent, meaning we have a structure, we have a trajectory that we're going on, but we're adapting it in response to the needs and the energy of the group that we're with, rather
mm,
than staying rigidly confined to our idea of how things are supposed to go.
mm,
And as such, it's a conversation. And the only way that you can start sensitizing to that invisible conversation that's taking place is if you've cultivated the capacity of a follower,
mm,
the ability to receive and respond to the guidance and the direction of others. So it's actually a collaborative journey. And rather than us enforcing anything or imposing anything, we're more like the stewards of the space.
mm.
They're in a role of service, even though we are the ones who are choosing the direction. The direction is in direct response to the people that we're in connection with. And there's a lot of different layers to this, depending on, like going back to conscious kink,
Yeah.
depending on the scene that you're stepping in with someone else, there can be varying degrees of all of these things. Like if somebody just doesn't want to make any decisions whatsoever, then that's a very specific kind of scene you're going in with somebody. But even that has to have certain protocols around it so that harm isn't caused. But ideally, a very skillful Dom is attuned to the sub. And they're constantly checking in, sometimes verbally, but also in nonverbal ways to make sure that the sub is not being pushed beyond their thresholds
Mm,
so that both parties can actually still enjoy the unfolding of the encounter. So it is a conversation rather than a mandate that's being
yeah.
imposed upon someone.
I think from what I've learned in my experiences with you and the conversations we've had is that's a skill that I'm really hungry to develop. Like I want to practice. That's a way I'm leaning, and I realize that I need to balance that on being the follower as well. Is I want to learn how to be in that dominant position, in that leadership, in that guidance, but highly attuned to the person I'm relating with, and it's almost it's interesting because the word scene for so long was confusing to me. I was like, what? The scene? But I realized that it's important to have a scene because it's like the structure. It begins
Yeah.
here and it ends here. And it's like the scene is over and those agreements only exist within the scene and then it dissipates. And it's important for it to work.
Hmm.
And uh, yeah, as I lean into wanting to be in that position of dominant in a confident, calm, healthy way, I realize that's a huge skill that I want to learn is like being attuned to the other and reading their body language, reading their breath, reading what's going on. Even if they're saying, yes, I want more of that, but their body's like really clearly saying something else.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a few really important components that you're bringing up here. The first, in regards to the scene. So you're stepping into a non-ordinary encounter or an intentional encounter with someone, which is very similar to a ceremony or a
Mm,
ritual or a
mm,
shamanic practice, or even something like, if somebody has ever been involved in acting. I love the modality of acting because for me, it's a very shamanic experience of you're opening into a different aspect of yourself and letting it be more fully expressed than your normal day-to-day personality. And through that, you're excavating into deeper layers of what that energy feels like and how it moves through you and how you expresses to fulfill a certain function,
mm.
right? You're not taking it on as a permanent identity. You're
Yeah.
consciously exploring a living energy or a desire in a more dramatic or exaggerated fashion than what's normal so that you can harvest the benefits of that encounter in a very focused way. And as with any type of ceremony or ritual or even community containers, there's certain protocols that need to be set in place for like the rules of this encounter, the rules of this very unique space.
Mm,
And this is when we're beginning, and this is where we're ending. And this also is connected to therapeutic processing as well when you're stepping in with a therapist or a body-centered practitioner. There's certain rules of engaging with one another in order to maintain the integrity of the interaction itself.
mm.
So that's really important. That's a big part of consent and allowing each person to have the safety to explore openly and honestly without harm being caused. I can't remember what the second piece is. I lost myself as I was talking
Well,
there. So maybe I'll just pause there to see
yeah,
what's going on
something
for
came
you.
up for me there. It was the importance of that intentionality and the potency of that intentionality. In my experience, it really did provide that curious exploration. It's like I don't even know the right word, but it felt just so different and it feels so different because there is that intentionality, because that there is that ceremonial aspect. There are the rules and the guidelines. And I look around in the world, in my own experience, in most intimacy and most sexuality, there aren't those intentionalities or agreements within intimate contact, which what I see is there's a lot of safety that isn't established there, which means there isn't as much depth that's possible.
Hmm. Like there isn't as much depth.
When without the
Ah,
intentionality and the structure that comes with conscious kink that's like This is what it's allowed. I'm going to say this when I'm going to say yellow when it's getting into something that doesn't, like, all these subtle details allow me to relax into safety and know that I have this structure that allows me to go deeper. And so I see in we'll say generalized normal intimate encounters, without the intentionality, there isn't as much room to go as deep.
Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions that are being made in our encounters. And I think part of the safety actually just comes from clarity.
Yeah.
Like, what are the edges? What are
Yeah.
the agreements? What's on the table? What's not on the table? And making that conscious is part of consent. I often give the example of there's this one study done. I can't remember who it was by, but they were looking at um, schoolyard playgrounds. And they found that when the playground area was um, surrounded by a fence, the children would go and explore the entire territory. And you see this all the time when you're driving by schools, like kids
Yeah.
are hanging out right in the corners or kicking soccer balls up against the fence or whatever. They explore the whole territory because there's
Wow.
clearly defined boundaries. And there's
Wow.
also insulation for their experience, versus if the playground doesn't have a fence around it, all the children will congregate in the center because
Whoa.
that's where they feel the safest. So this is what the agreements provide: an established territory of boundaries so that you know what's on the table and what's not, and nothing beyond that is going to be taking place. It grants a lot of freedom to explore all the way up to the edges and no further. And then I remember the second part I was going to talk about. One of the ways that we identify what those boundaries are, and one of the reasons why we start with consent and boundaries, is because you have to have a somatic sense of what that feels like in your own body, and you have to have the ability to communicate it in real time.
Mm,
And both of these things are suppressed
yeah.
in most people. First, our ability to feel both intensity and subtlety.
Yeah.
The second is being able to communicate that honestly. Both of those things are skills,
Yeah.
and we haven't been taught that for the most part. And so we need to remember those aspects of ourselves to cultivate those skills of highly sensitized feeling of what's going on in my body and developing the capacity and the willingness to communicate that in real time. Because if you're with somebody who isn't aware of or isn't able to communicate their boundaries, they're not a safe person to engage with because you'll unintentionally cross their boundaries. They will feel harmed, and then that will have repercussions for both of you. So you'll be unintentionally stepping beyond the boundaries of consent because something hasn't been felt or expressed. And so, how can you create safety in those kinds of encounters? And this is what most sexual encounters are for people. You're just making a lot of assumptions about, what you have permission for now, and what the other person's desires are. And there's almost no awareness whatsoever of what their boundaries are. And again, these will change encounter by encounter, person by person. So there's a lot of harm that's caused unintentionally. It's nobody's fault
Yeah.
necessarily. It's just because we're not communicating from this level of awareness that really empowers us in those spaces.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That was another piece that came up for me when I was working with you, how good it felt to trust in you to speak to your boundaries and to know what your boundaries were. And I was like, wow, I want this in my intimate relationships. I want to establish this where I trust my partner to speak to their boundaries, and we have clear established boundaries so I know what they are. I know, like you said, the schoolyard fence that I can walk to and kick the soccer ball in the corner and be like, okay, it's all right to play here. And my partner will say, oh, nope, that corner's off limits today. It's
Yeah.
normally open, but today it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it actually becomes a lot of fun. Be like, okay, now we're going into a practice to find boundaries together. And then there's a way to approach that. It's like a lot of checking in, going like really slow, of like, Okay, how does this feel in your system? How do you know if it's a yes, a maybe, or a no internally? And actually investigating that. Like you're going in as an erotic scientist, trying to
Yeah.
figure out different names for conscious kink because there's so many associations with it. I'm
Erotic
like, what?
scientist, yes.
Yeah, it's like, what is this? It's more of like somatic relational intelligence, but that doesn't sound as sexy.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
there's pros and cons to these names. It's like, do I want it to be highly charged but misconstrued or like super scientific and unsexy? It's like, I don't exactly
Well,
know, but
you brought up another powerful thing was that in the experience, I remember we started and you were across the room and I forget if I started with my eyes closed or what it was, but you had me adjust to you slowly stepping closer and closer to me and like checking in with how it felt. And I think I actually would be the one you would either ask or I would say to take the next step forward or something. And man, that attunement is just a whole nother level. And I can only imagine how potent that would be for partners to have that more regularly. It's like, okay, how do you feel with me this far away from you now? Okay, I'm going to come a little bit closer to you. Okay, how is that feeling in your body? Okay, I'm going to come. I mean, that in itself was mind blowing.
yeah, the detail that you can start bringing to these investigations is quite shocking when you first realize like what is actually happening in our system with micro adjustments. So just to give the people listening a sense of that practice. So everything kind of like builds on each other. So generally one of the first practices is to just sit there with your eyes closed, to breathe in to feel your body. And then I'm sitting a certain distance away from you. And then the next step would be, okay, now with your eyes closed, I'm just going to move my body just a little bit closer to yours. I'm not going to make contact. I'm just going to come a little bit closer, and you still have your eyes closed here. And so I'd be sitting a little bit closer, and the person would feel into what changed in their own body and what it felt like. Maybe there's like fearful anticipation because you can't see the other. Maybe you
Mm,
can actually tangibly sense their presence a little bit closer.
mm,
So maybe for some people, it's actually kind of like soothing. They might actually want closeness in terms of like contact. Maybe it's something that they're actually longing for. So that's the starting point. And then from there, we're invited to open the eyes to actually take in the other person in front of you and then to periodically close your eyes and reconnect back to your body. Because generally, when we open our eyes and become aware of environment, we lose touch with the heightened sensitivity of what's going on in our own system. And so we kind of go back and forth between opening the eyes, becoming aware of the other, closing the eyes, becoming aware of the body to reduce the distance between those 2 points of awareness. And then we kind of enhance the level of intimacy in that encounter where instead of just taking each other in, now we make eye contact, actually recognize and acknowledge the other. And again, kind of going back and forth between internal awareness, external contact, internal awareness, external contact. And then I move my body away from them again, back to my original position, and they check into their body to see how that change affected them. So this is just like one of the starting practices. And you can see we're bringing hyper awareness to micro adjustments so that we can sense how we're affected by certain things. And then you can start evolving that of like moving to a standing position, then you being in control of my movements. Maybe you tell me when to come closer, when to move further, how to position my body. Like, how does it feel if I'm in front of you versus beside you? How does it feel when I'm beside you facing you versus beside you and facing the same direction as you? Like, all these micro adjustments affect everybody in completely different ways. And obviously, this is connected to our past traumas and experiences. Like for me personally, if I'm standing side by side with another man, generally it feels like camaraderie. It's like brotherhood kind of versus if I'm standing and they're turning and facing me, it feels like I'm being judged or analyzed,
yeah,
you know, just a shift of body
yeah.
position. And then it gets really interesting. It's like, what happens if you stand behind me and I can't even see you?
Ooh, I remember we
What does
did
that
that.
bring? Right. Yeah, so all of these are like the foundational kind of like stepping stones to really expand our awareness on a micro level of what's happening in our system, because that's where you start finding how you're affected by things. And through that, you start to discover what your boundaries are or what your edges are, what you're interested in exploring. Because it doesn't just illuminate boundaries, it also illuminates desires.
Yes.
You know, like some people are kind of surprised by how they're affected. It's like, oh, when you were behind me, I actually felt, safer than when you were standing directly in front of me. It's like,
Right.
isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
You discover a lot through these kinds of explorations. And all of that is done before we even start making physical contact with each other.
I revisiting the experience and thinking about it is bringing up a lot for me, and a lot of passion and a lot of it was magical. I was blown away by the simplicity and the intimacy felt in it. And once again, I love that you started peeling apart arrows, because it's like I'm I'm learning so much from you in this department, which is how can I feel more of that intimacy and connection in my life and peel it apart from sexuality to,
Mhm.
I mean, literally, we're talking about being in the same room together and you walking around in circles and us. And sometimes my eyes are closed and, or the participants' eyes are closed and then they're open. It's like, it's as basic of a thing as it gets. And yet the level of intimacy in it is profound, maybe more profound than some intimate sexual encounters.
Totally. Yeah. And, this is one of the reasons why this is, it's a foundational skill for understanding how the human system works. It's like most people actually don't even, most people are somewhat dissociated from their body,
Yeah.
but our body is an incredibly complex and intelligent receiving and transmitting station.
Mm,
We respond to visible and invisible, internal and external stimuli. And there's so much information in our somatic responses, in our physiological responses, but also in the emotions that arise and the thoughts that are generated in response to those feelings. All of this is information of what our system is receiving and how we are responding to the things in our environment. Everybody has had this experience in some way, shape, or form. Like you meet a person and like something feels off and you don't exactly know why, or you see someone across the room and you immediately have like a really strong attraction, even though you don't know anything about that person. Like this is information within our own system. So, kind of what we're doing here is we're starting to learn the language of feelings,
mm,
how to become aware of the communications, but also how to interpret them, and then how to become the voice for our body. And then
mm.
this translates into every area of our lives. It's like the classic mindfulness practices of like, say, periodically stopping and taking a breath and closing your eyes and checking in with your body. Why would you do that? Because you can get a sense of what your current needs are. You don't access that through the mind. You can have a whole bunch of ideas, but
Yeah.
if you really check in with your body and you're able to interpret those signals, then you'll be able to tend your authentic needs in connection to what is true in that moment. So the application of this is virtually infinite. It's not limited to sexual encounters,
Yeah.
but one of the things that opens up when we're engaging in these kinds of explorations with another person, then it opens up real intimate exchange through deepened awareness. How am I affecting you?
Mm,
How are you affecting me? What are my desires in response to how we are affecting each other?
mm,
Being aware of that and being able to communicate it as well as the edges. It's like, okay, this is the limit for me. And the boundary is not a way of preventing contact and connection. The boundary is the threshold that needs to be in place so that ongoing intimate contact may continue, right?
mm.
So all of these are relational skills, but it's also things that you can apply in virtually every area of your life that most people don't give very much attention to.
While you were speaking, I remembered that it's still a huge educational piece this understanding of the body's intelligence outside of the analytical thinking mind, and how much of a profound developmental skill it is to know, to not to, for one, think that there's any benefit to listening to your body. I'll say that there's any benefit, for one, that would take a person down a path to learn the skills that are infinitely deep in the sensations, the more subtler and subtler sensations that we can be attuned to. I think it's got to be infinitely deep.
As far as I know, yeah, because if you follow it deep enough, then you start getting into esoteric territory, shamanic territory. As soon as you have the tangible, like visceral, direct experience of intelligent energy moving through your system that your mind doesn't comprehend, that is sometimes being informed by invisible forces. What are the implications of that if you really sit with that for a moment? To recognize that your human system, your body, is able to receive invisible signals and is communicating to your conscious mind in a way that your mind currently doesn't understand. And if we just take the attention off of esoteric principles for a second and we just go into therapeutic principles, this is the foundation for all forms of body-centered psychotherapy, which have really just started emerging over the last few decades in our culture, which is called a bottom-up approach to therapy.
Mm,
Things like somatic experiencing, Hakomi method, bioenergetics, conscious connected breath work, EMDR to a certain degree. And all of these modalities kind of emerged in our world in response to the study of trauma, once
mm,
trauma became an official diagnosis
yeah,
sometime in the 70s or so. Up until that point, all the therapeutic modalities were mostly top-down therapy, like talk therapy,
yeah,
psychotherapy, counseling, where you're sifting through thoughts, narratives, memories, images to try to trace your way down into the core. And it takes a
yeah,
very long time.
yeah.
And there's no guarantee that if you do even find the core, that it's necessarily going to resolve itself.
Right.
Because that type of resolution doesn't happen on the level of mind. It happens on the level of feeling.
Mm,
And that's normally the territory that's being suppressed. And unfortunately, with talk therapy, it can sometimes even amplify our ability to analyze instead of actually going into feeling. So, unprocessed feelings
yeah.
is what trauma is. It's unintegrated energy. How do we actually process that out of the nervous system? It's by allowing those original feelings to rise up in their original intensity and to discharge out of the system. What does discharge mean? Discharge means expression.
Yeah.
So it allows spontaneous feeling to be felt and to be expressed without inhibiting it or analyzing it or trying to control it. That's therapeutic processing on a body centered level. And so the more you dive into these modalities, and I utilize breath work most regularly because it's the most accessible for people, and you have a lot of agency over the level of intensity that you want to explore with the power of your breath. As soon as you start exploring it, again, you get the tangible experience of a living intelligence activating in your own system that knows what needs to happen for resolution to occur, that you don't actually need to control it or guide it or direct it in any way. And you can
Yeah.
tie this back into the role of the sub.
Yeah.
If you actually trust that your body is the dom in this encounter and you are the sub,
Wow.
can you surrender to it fully from a place of trust, knowing that it's actually in service to you? And the more skilled you become at this, the more illuminating and spontaneous and surprising the experiences become. Your body can actually start moving and shaking and expressing in ways that you're not controlling. It's like, holy fuck. Like there's an actual intelligence trying to move through me. And then from there, you realize the same thing is happening with emotions.
Mm,
Emotions also know how to process themselves when they're
mm,
not being controlled. And so the therapeutic modalities are ways of kind of like insulating the experience to give access points to investigate and to explore and to express. Again, kind of like a scientist.
mm.
As you start expanding your capacity for feeling and dissolving the resistance around expression.
Mm.
So it's the same core principles that are being applied in esoteric mysticism, in body-centered psychotherapy, and in conscious kink practices. It's all the same stuff. We just have different, tools that we're drawing forth and different structures that we're putting in place to explore it. But it's infinite as far as I can tell.
One of the things that I've become increasingly passionate about, because it's played a huge part of my journey, is realizing how, you talked about letting the body be the dom. And that was one of the things that I learned through these boundary practices is how often I had crossed my mind's craving for something had continually crossed the boundaries of my body and never asked my body's openness. In the same way that we're practicing those things in conscious kink, how do you feel when I'm across the room for you? Me going, body, how does it feel to bring in arousal, to touch my genitals? How does that are you is am I open to that right now, body? Am I open to touching my genitals in this way? And I'm realizing that's a big passion for me in my own path and with other men is understanding the profound intelligence that the body has and finding whatever information is needed to trust enough to go into that scary unknown territory that is treating my body like a conscious being.
Yeah, there's another layer here which is really interesting, which I've come into contact with a variety of times, many times, where in some circumstances, my body has actually lost trust in me,
Totally. Totally.
especially in regards to like sexual encounters is a really easy example to draw upon because without going into the whole story, I experienced some sexual trauma when I was younger, which kind of crossed the wires of pleasure and fear. So when I would be aroused and had the opportunity to engage sexually, my body would go into fear and panic because it was connected to that past experience. And so I wanted to engage so much. And I'm like, fuck you, body, just do what I want you to do. But the body's like, no, I'm scared. And me trying to like force something to happen caused it to shut down even more. And so it created like an adversarial relationship with my own system where we had competing desires. And so myself and my partner Aga will approach this constantly. It's almost like when we're engaging sexually, it's not just two individuals. It's actually kind of like a four-way, you know, where
Yeah.
like I have my personal desires, but then there's also the needs of what's being expressed through my body. And then maybe Aga has the desire, but like her body's not ready yet. So we're like checking in with each other, but we're also checking in with the body as well. It becomes a much more dynamic conversation. And us again, kind of like being the mouthpiece of like, this is what's going in my body. And like, I want this, but I can tell like my body's not ready for it yet. So this might be supportive if like we started here first. And then, it becomes much more rich, dynamic, emergent experience where we're not trying to push our desires on our own bodies. We're actually listening to them and responding in a way that allows them to open organically from that place of safety. So it's a really interesting question to sit with. Like, what are the times that you've tried to force your body to do something when you're actually receiving a no internally? And what are the consequences of that?
I think most men, especially, I'll say, I'll just speak for the US because that's where I'm from, but a large percentage of men have lost that trust with their body. And my hypothesis, my opinion, I don't know how much weight it holds from my own experience, is that this is a lot of why we're seeing all the erectile dysfunction stuff going on with
Mm,
20 and 30-year olds because their body's like, dude, no more of this. I'm done. I don't, there's no trust, there's no relationship. It's just force, 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 force. And eventually the body's like, I can't take these peak experiences out of nowhere and it's just like shut down almost.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a whole big territory just in and of itself. Again, I'll just speak to my own experience. I realized relatively recently how angry I felt towards my own penis and how much shame and guilt I felt connected to my penis.
Mm.
And even using like different words, like cock or dick, it's like trying to change the name that I'm using of something that
Yeah.
like feels more like the energy that I want. But like reflecting on it, it's like all throughout my childhood, it was spoken of as a penis. And even just saying
Wow.
that word almost like puts me into like a
Wow.
younger place and
Yeah.
realizing like, holy shit, like I've basically used my penis for my own pleasure, all the while thinking that it was inherently bad.
Yeah.
So there's all this like guilt and judgment associated with that part of my body. And so part of the self-pleasure practice that I've been doing over the last couple of years is about like celebrating and honoring that part of my body. It's like, yeah, you're not bad. You're not wrong. You're not a villain.
Mm.
It's like, I love you. I celebrate you. And like really affirming that part of my body in connection to the pleasure sensation to repattern that.
Wow.
And I think a lot of men actually have this in an unconscious way where they feel like their sexual energy and their sexual organs are predatory,
Oh yeah.
like they're villainous. And so they
Yeah.
have this relationship and then they're trying to cope with that by kind of like putting on some sort of persona where they're like, no, it's like, yeah, I'm powerful and fucking awesome. And, but underneath of that, they're like really, really sad,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. There's so much depth that I've come in contact with in my own experience when we're able to have these conversations. And I think it's one of the reasons why I've picked it as my main focus, my main passion. I feel like there's just so many layers and so much available to reclaim. And, it's the classic peeling the onion layers back to get more connected to something more closer to truth than the
Hmm.
many layers of illusion and pain and beliefs and dysfunctional behaviors and habits and how that's being expressed. So,
Yeah. Yeah, this is so much more than just a personal thing. This is cultural. This is ancestral. These programs, these wounds that we're carrying, these stories that we're living in go way farther back than just our own personal lives. So the work that we're doing is to, support each other in our remembering process, in our reclamation process.
mm,
And this is one of the reasons why like certain tantric practices are so powerful for both men and women, like these worshiping practices of like really worshiping the yoni and the body of the woman and like whispering prayers and like affection and love and celebration and worship, and why it's such a huge turn on for so many men, cock worship, to actually have their cock be wanted and desired and welcome and accepted and worshiped.
yeah,
It hits something so much deeper than just the skin. It's like a reclamation piece. But again, like tying this into conscious kink again, those are like focused experiences that help integrate these fragmented parts inside of us. They're not identities to be claimed as a permanent state. It's like you are not a god that should be worshiped 24/7 by your partner. That's not reasonable. That's not a healthy way of relating to expect that or to demand that of your partner. But it is entirely reasonable to request that as an experience so that you can integrate that part and repair the broken relationship with the body and with the penis in connection to a woman. Like for me, the wounding happened at the hands of a woman. And so to receive that repair from a woman is the reconciliation that my body has actually been wanting.
mm,
And for me to participate in that process is tremendously healing. So, this is a big part of the whole conscious approach of using kink to explore consciousness and consciousness to explore kink. They work together, and we can't do this in isolation. We have to do this in connection with another person. That's
mm.
where the wounding is, and that's also where the repair is.
Where can men find more of your stuff? Do you have any events coming up? How can listeners check you out?
Yeah, I have a lot of different offerings for my local practice is in Vancouver, BC. If you want to reach out and work with me directly in person, there's two places that you can find me. One is on thesomaheart.com. That's the
I'll
breath
put the
work.
links in the description too.
Great. Yeah, those are ceremonies, breathwork, group events. And then you can also find my personal website, which is deusfortier.com. That's more for one-on-one coaching and my online masterclass for men. And then I also have a lot of men's offerings that are becoming more and more the center point of my work. And those are in collaboration with Ian McKenzie. So we do in-person retreats, both weekend retreats and 5-day retreats. We have an online program called The Deep Masculine, and we have an ongoing men's community where we explore all of these forbidden topics of our culture called the Satyrs Den. And all of that can be found on themythicmasculine.com.
I'm looking to join that one, so I'll see you all in there if you join. Thank you so much, Deus, for showing up and sharing your wisdom and outside of this podcast, all the wisdom you share with me, and I'm feeling lit up to come visit in person again.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's good to be with you as always, and may it continue.
Yeah. Thank you everybody for listening. This is another episode of Men and Sex. Many more to come. If you have any subjects that you want to hear about, reach out to me, share them with me. And if you want to come on the podcast, reach out as well. We'll see you in the next episode.